Is it selfish to have children? That seems to be on a lot of people's minds lately as the world descends into absolute chaos. I see people all over TikTok and YouTube asking women how they could possibly bring a child into the world at a time like this. And since I'm about to bring my own into the world, I thought this would be a good topic to go over. David Benatar has a message for everyone, and it's not exactly a comfortable one. His message is that it would have been better if you and I had never been born, because being born at all, under any circumstance, is a harm. And bringing a child into the world is, by that logic, a moral wrong. Now, this is called antinatalism, and Benatar is its most serious modern defender. His book, Better Never to Have Been, lays out the case with genuine philosophical rigor, and it is worth taking seriously, because the arguments are more difficult to dismiss than they first appear. But that does not mean that I think they are right. And today I want to walk through the strongest things that Benatar has to say, and then let some other thinkers have their response. Now, Benatar's foundational argument is built around the symmetry between pain and pleasure. His view is essentially that preventing suffering is better and more moral than potentially taking away pleasure. Imagine a child who, if born, would suffer terribly. Now, most would agree that it might have been better for that child if they were never born in the first place, to prevent that suffering, because preventing their suffering would be considered a good thing. But now imagine a child who, if born, would actually experience great happiness throughout their life. But you decide to not have that child. Is that child harmed by never existing? Well, Benatar says no. The potential pleasure that they never got to experience is not necessarily bad for them, because there is no them to be deprived of anything. And so we have this asymmetry. Preventing suffering is good, even for someone who never exists. But preventing pleasure is merely neutral. And since every human life contains some suffering, Benatar concludes that creating any life is creating a harm. This suffering side of the ledger always counts against existence, while the pleasure side never fully counts in favor of it. Every time someone has a kid, they are, in Benatar's view, doing something morally questionable, because they are guaranteeing that a new person will experience some kind of suffering in their life. And according to him, no amount of joy that that person ever experiences can fully offset that guarantee. But it's not all as it seems, because John Stuart Mill would not have had much patience for this accounting system. Benatar's framework treats all suffering as equivalent and all pleasure as equivalent. It's essentially a ledger where you add up the good and subtract the bad. But Mill argued that this misses something fundamental about human experience. Not all pleasures are equal, and suffering is not always negative in the long run. Mill's famous line is that it is better to be a Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And what he meant is that a life of intellectual depth, moral struggle, and genuine engagement with the world, even if it is harder and more painful, is actually more valuable than a pleasant but shallow one. The quality of experience does matter, not just how comfortable it is. And many of the things that make life feel most worth living are inseparable from the difficulty. The love that you feel someone is deepened by the fear of losing them. The pride that you take in an accomplishment is proportional to how hard it was. And compassion only exists because suffering does. A parent who loses a child would not say that they wish the child had never existed. Pain and pleasure always go hand in hand. And so, if you removed all suffering from a human life, that doesn't mean that their life would be better. You would simply get a flat, robotic one. And a life that had never been tested, never been stretched, and never had the occasion to discover what it was made of. Mill would say that Benatar is solving for the wrong thing entirely. Now, Benatar would respond that we don't know how bad our lives actually are, because he anticipates the most obvious objections to his view, which is simply that most people are glad they were born. When you ask people, even those who had difficult lives and are seriously ill, whether they wish they had never existed, the majority of them will say no. Now, of course, there will always be exceptions. But Benatar's response is that we cannot trust the judgment from people who say no. He argues that human beings are psychologically wired towards optimism in ways that distort our self-assessment. We remember the past more fondly than it was. We imagine the future more brightly than it will be. And we adapt to suffering over time until it no longer registers as suffering. And we tend to evaluate our own lives by comparing ourselves to people around us, rather than by any honest absolute standard. And so when you say, "my life is good," Benatar thinks that you are largely reporting a cognitive bias, not an accurate assessment of your actual experience. If you could see your life more clearly, stripped of all of these psychological mechanisms that soften its edges, then you would find it considerably more characterized by discomfort, frustration, and unmet desire than you currently believe. Now, this is a genuinely unsettling argument because it's not so easy to refute from the inside. Because how would you know if your contentment was real or just a very convincing illusion that your brain has constructed? Well, this is where we turn to Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist who survived Auschwitz, and if anyone had the grounds to agree with Benatar, to look at human suffering and conclude that existence is not worth the cost, it was him. And yet, he arrived at the very opposite conclusion. What Frankl observed, both in the camps and in decades of clinical practice afterward, was that suffering itself is not what breaks people. What breaks people is suffering without meaning. The prisoners who were most likely to psychologically survive, and in many cases physically survived, were not the ones who suffered the least. They were actually the ones who had a reason to endure it. A person to get back to, a work that they felt compelled to finish, or even a belief that their suffering was part of something larger than themselves. His conclusion was that meaning is not something life simply gives to you. It's something that you have to bring to life. Not all of us are programmed automatically to look at the good in our lives. In fact, a lot of us actually tend to look at the bad and focus on the negative and the suffering. But crucially, some of the deepest sources of meaning are only available through difficulty. Caring for a sick parent or child, persisting through a painful creative process, or rebuilding after a loss. These experiences do not just happen to contain meaning despite their difficulty. The difficulty is part of what generates the meaning. And this is a direct answer to Benatar's ledger. Frankl is not arguing that suffering is pleasant or that we should actually seek it out. He's arguing that Benatar's framework is measuring the wrong thing entirely. The question should not be how much pain a life contains versus how much pleasure it has, but instead whether that life is oriented towards something that makes the pain more bearable, and in many cases, something that makes it worthwhile. Now, of course, Benatar says that we cannot trust these people's assessments that their lives are good. But Frankel would say that that's precisely because Benatar is looking at happiness, when he should be looking at meaning. People do not need to primarily feel good. They simply need to feel that their lives matter. And that need, unlike Benatar's pleasure-pain calculus, is one that suffering can actually serve. Benatar has a more meaningful life because he has a message for the world. And while I can't speak for his personal feelings, research has shown that those who have meaning and purpose tend to fare better psychologically. And finally, I want to tackle one of the most foundational parts of his argument, that you can harm somebody and that you will harm them by giving them a life. Benatar's final move is perhaps the most intuitive sounding, which is why it's worth examining a little bit more carefully. He says that bringing a child into the world is harming them, because you are guaranteeing that they will suffer without their consent. The child cannot agree to be born. They cannot weigh the suffering against the joy and decide whether the deal is worth it. That decision is made for them. And Benatar says that this is the moral problem. This is the consent argument. And on the surface, it has a certain force to it. We generally believe that doing something significant for another person without their consent is wrong. And being born is about as significant as it gets. But the argument runs into a gigantic wall. Consent requires a person who exists to actually give it. So Benatar is asking you to treat the interests of a non-existent person as something that can be violated, which is a very strange philosophical move. Because think about what it would actually mean to say that someone was harmed by being given a life that they go on to value. That person is here and living, and in most cases are glad to be alive. In what sense have they been wronged? You cannot point to a version of them that is better off, because the only version of them that exists is the one who is alive. We cannot say, well, you remember when you broke your arm and suffered for months? If you were never born, that wouldn't have happened. And sure, the arm of an unborn person can never be broken. But that does not mean that the life is not worth living. Daniel Parfit called this the non-identity problem, and it does create a genuine paradox for Benatar. The very person Benatar says was harmed by being born is a person whose existence his argument depends on. If they had not been born, there would be no one to have been harmed. The harm and the harmed person arrive together, which means that the framework of harm does not quite apply in the way that Benatar needs it to. There's also something worth noting about the consent argument. While a person cannot consent to life, they also cannot consent to not living. By bringing them into the world, you are actually giving them more autonomy over their own decisions. But if you choose to never bring them here, you are stripping them of the very ability to make that decision. Once a person is here, they can make their own decision about whether their life is worth living. There's no law that says a person cannot unalive themselves, even if it is looked down upon. And yes, while there are people who suffer long enough to wish they had never been born, there are hundreds of thousands of more people who are glad to be here. At some point, acting on behalf of those who cannot yet speak for themselves is not a moral failing. It is simply what care looks like. Coming to the conclusion that no one should have kids because every human being suffers and does not consent to that suffering is a paradox in and of itself. Even if you were to reduce human life down to the most basic biological function, which is reproduction. The way in which reproduction happens is almost like consent. The egg has to allow the sperm in, and the sperm chosen has to fight to be accepted. Most people think that it's simply the fastest swimmer, but that's not how it works. It is not simply who gets there first, but who is the best choice. And if that's not a form of consent, then I don't know what is. Benatar is asking a real question, and it is worth sitting with it rather than simply dismissing it. How much suffering is too much? What do we owe to people that we choose to bring into a world we did not design carefully enough and cannot fully control? But I think his answers fail for a reason that runs through all three of the counterarguments that we have looked at today. Benatar treats life as something that happens to be a person, a set of experiences to be evaluated from the outside, tallied up, and judged. But Mill and Frankel and the consent argument all push back on this in different ways, and they're all pointing at the same thing. Life is not a ledger. It's a project. It is something that a person makes meaning from, and the making of that meaning is not diminished by difficulty, because in many ways it depends on it. So, with that said, thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, do not forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see y'all next time.